In 1973, one of the richest women in America died and gave the United States government a free palace. 114 rooms, 17 oceanfront acres in Palm Beach, marble shipped from Italy, tiles pulled from a Cuban castle. And the government said no, twice. This is the true story of how that happened and what it actually teaches us about money, because the lesson at the center of it applies just as much to a small family business as it does to a $100 million estate. Stick around to the end, and if stories like this are your thing, go ahead and follow now so you don't miss the next one. Here's the part that makes this story worth telling in the first place. The woman who built that palace did not lose her fortune. She did not get swindled, she did not gamble it away, and she was not broke when she died. She remained one of the wealthiest women in the country until her final day. And yet the single greatest thing she ever built, the house she hoped would represent the entire nation, ended up unwanted by almost everyone who was offered it, eventually landing on the edge of a demolition order before anyone stepped in to save it. Understanding how that happened tells you something most people never learn about money, which is that having a fortune and keeping a fortune are two completely different skills. Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post, and to understand how she ended up here, you have to go back to a small town in Michigan decades before any of this happened. Marjorie's father, Charles William Post, was not born wealthy. In the late 1800s, he found himself in Battle Creek, Michigan, a town that had become an unlikely center of the American health food movement, filled with sanitariums and doctors experimenting with diet and wellness. Post spent time in one of these institutions himself, and while he was there, he became fascinated with the idea of building food products around health and convenience. In 1895, he launched a company selling a roasted grain drink meant to replace coffee, which he called Postum. It was an odd product to bring to a country full of dedicated coffee drinkers, but Post understood marketing in a way that was ahead of his time, and the product found an audience. He followed it with a cereal called Grape Nuts, and then another called Post Toasties. Within just a few years, his small operation had grown into one of the most successful food companies in the country, based out of a town that would soon proudly call itself the cereal capital of the world. It's worth pausing on just how unlikely that success story actually was. Battle Creek at the time was full of competing health food entrepreneurs, all chasing the same general idea of wellness through diet. And most of those ventures never grew beyond small regional operations. What separated Post from the crowd of people trying similar things around him was less about the product itself and more about how relentlessly he sold it, treating advertising and marketing as seriously as the manufacturing process itself, at a time when most food companies barely thought about branding at all. Marjorie grew up inside that success. Her father brought her into the business early, walking her through the factory, explaining how the company actually made its money, treating her less like a child to be protected from the details, and more like someone he was training. That decision mattered enormously because in 1914, Charles Post died, and at just 27 years old, his daughter inherited the entire company. Picture what that actually meant in 1914. Marjorie's inheritance was worth somewhere around $20 million at the time, an amount that would translate to hundreds of millions of dollars today. She became one of the richest people in the entire country at an age when most young women of that era could not vote, could not sit on a corporate board, and in many cases could not even sign a legal contract without a husband's name attached to it. Marjorie inherited outright control of a national company, and rather than simply collecting checks and letting other people run things, she got to work growing it. Over the following years, alongside her second husband, a Wall Street financier named Edward Hutton, Marjorie went on an acquisition spree that reshaped the entire American pantry. Jell-O joined the company. Maxwell House Coffee joined it too, an almost ironic addition given that her father had built his original fortune trying to replace coffee entirely. In 1929, the growing company was reorganized under a new name that would become a permanent fixture in American kitchens for the rest of the century, General Foods. That same year, Marjorie pushed her husband toward what would become the company's most transformative decision. An inventor named Clarence Birdseye had developed a method for flash freezing food in a way that preserved its taste far better than anything previously possible. Marjorie recognized what she was looking at almost immediately, and after months of pushing, General Foods acquired Birdseye's frozen food operation for around $22 million. That single deal essentially created the modern frozen food industry. A company that had started as a single coffee substitute now reached into breakfast, dinner, dessert, and the freezer aisle all at once. By the middle of the 20th century, Marjorie Post was regularly described as the wealthiest woman in America, and she was not just running a business empire from behind a desk. In Washington, she became one of the most celebrated hostesses of her era, throwing legendary parties and galas, with an invitation to her events considered nearly as prestigious as an invitation to the White House itself. Her generosity matched the scale of her fortune. She funded field hospitals for the Red Cross during the First World War. supported Salvation Army feeding programs through the Depression, backed the National Symphony, and helped bring the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts into existence. If you're enjoying learning about a piece of history most people never get taught in school, make sure you're following this channel, because we're about to get into the part of the story where all of that success quietly planted the seeds of everything that came apart later. Because here's what Marjorie did with a fortune this size. She built monuments, extraordinary, breathtaking monuments, and almost none of them were built with any thought toward whether they could ever support themselves financially. The centerpiece of all of it was Mar-a-Lago. In the mid-1920s, on a narrow strip of Palm Beach where the Atlantic Ocean meets an inland lagoon, Marjorie commissioned the construction of what would become one of the largest private homes ever built in the United States. She hired architect Marion Sims Wyeth, along with Viennese stage designer Joseph Urban, and gave them essentially unlimited creative freedom. The team imported Spanish and Italian tile and stone, incorporated marble pulled from a demolished Cuban castle, and spent roughly 4 years turning the vision into reality. When construction finally finished in 1927, the estate spanned well over 100,000 square feet, with more than 50 bedrooms, dozens of bathrooms finished in gold-plated fixtures, and a great room with a ceiling reaching over 40 feet high. The final cost came to roughly $7 million, an amount that would be well over $100 million in today's money. Some accounts describe the reasoning behind building it so large as simple practicality. Marjorie's earlier Florida home had become too small to comfortably host her famously enormous parties. Mar-a-Lago was only the beginning. In Washington, D.C., she kept an equally grand estate called Hillwood, which she filled with an extraordinary collection of French and Russian art and artifacts. Up in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, she owned Camp Topridge, a rustic retreat spread across hundreds of acres, containing dozens of individual buildings, including a lodge styled after Russian architecture, where wealthy guests were flown in to experience roughing it in complete luxury. And out on the water, she owned what was, for a time, the largest privately owned sailing yacht in the world, a massive four-masted ship staffed by dozens of crew members and decorated with the same level of opulence as her homes on land. All of this was well within Marjorie's financial reach at the time she built it. The problem that almost nobody thinks about while admiring a beautiful new estate under construction is what happens to that estate decades later, long after the person who loved it, and who could easily afford it, is no longer around to keep paying for it. There is one more chapter to this collecting story that deserves its own moment, because it connects Marjorie's American fortune to one of the most dramatic collapses of wealth and power in modern history. In 1937, Marjorie's third husband, a lawyer named Joseph Davies, was appointed United States ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Marjorie accompanied him to Moscow. She arrived at a strange and specific moment. The Soviet government, desperate for foreign currency to fund its industrial and military ambitions, was quietly selling off treasures that had been seized decades earlier from the Russian imperial family, the Romanovs, an entire royal dynasty that had been violently overthrown and executed roughly 20 years before. Palaces full of imperial silver, porcelain, religious icons, and jewelry were essentially being liquidated to raise cash, and Marjorie, standing in Moscow with a fortune behind her, began buying. Over time, she acquired an extraordinary collection, including imperial Russian porcelain, icons, silver, and close to 90 pieces created by the legendary court jeweler Fabergé, including 2 of the famous jeweled imperial Easter eggs. To this day, her collection, housed at Hillwood, is considered the finest assembly of Russian imperial art and artifacts anywhere outside of Russia itself. It's worth clearing up a persistent myth here, too. Some retellings of this story claim Marjorie personally dined and negotiated with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. She did not. That kind of direct diplomatic engagement was handled by her husband, the actual ambassador. Marjorie's role in Moscow was as the collector, quietly acquiring pieces of a fallen dynasty's treasures, while her husband managed the official relationship with the Soviet government. Here is the underlying pattern running through every single one of these acquisitions. And it is the real engine driving this entire story. A palace does not generate income. A yacht does not pay dividends. A case full of Fabergé eggs behind museum glass does not produce a single dollar of revenue. It only produces bills for insurance, security, and climate control. Every time you convert liquid wealth into a beautiful, static object, you're not preserving your fortune. You're converting it into something that costs money to maintain every single year, indefinitely, with no natural mechanism for paying its own way. Economists and historians sometimes use an old phrase for exactly this kind of possession, drawn from a story about the ancient kings of Siam, who supposedly gifted rare white elephants to courtiers they secretly wanted to financially ruin. The animal was considered sacred, so it could not be put to work, sold, or harmed in any way. The only option was to feed it, house it, and care for it indefinitely, at enormous and unavoidable personal cost. A gift dressed up as an honor that quietly functioned as a curse. Mar-a-Lago, in every meaningful financial sense, became exactly that kind of gift. By some estimates, simply operating and maintaining Mar-a-Lago cost close to $1 million a year by the 1970s, just to keep the grounds maintained and the building intact against Florida's punishing heat and humidity. It generated no income of any kind. Marjorie could absorb that cost without a second thought, because General Foods was still generating an enormous and steady stream of income behind her. But a fortune, unlike a single lifetime, does not stay in one set of hands forever. It gets divided. It gets passed down. And the real question hanging over every large fortune is never whether the person who built it can afford to maintain their monuments. It's whether the people who inherit it afterward still can. Before we get into exactly how that played out, a quick pause. If you want to actually understand how fortunes like this rise and fall instead of just hearing about the mansions, hit that follow button now, because the next part of this story is where the real lesson comes into focus. As Marjorie grew older, she began thinking seriously about what would happen to her legacy after she was gone, and she landed on an idea that sounded beautiful on paper. She did not want Mar-a-Lago to simply become another wealthy family's private beach house once she passed away. She wanted it to serve the entire country, so in her will, she left the estate to the United States government, with the hope that it would become a winter retreat for sitting presidents, a place to host foreign leaders and dignitaries against the backdrop of the Atlantic Ocean, a permanent symbol of the nation's hospitality. She died in 1973, and her greatest creation officially became a gift to the American people. And the American people, once officials actually looked at what maintaining it would cost, did not want it. The core problem was one that Marjorie's gift never solved. A building handed over for free is not really free if it comes attached to an enormous ongoing bill that the recipient has no way to cover. Federal officials looked at the estate and saw roughly $1 million a year in required upkeep with absolutely no mechanism to earn any of that back. On top of the financial concern, there were serious security issues too. The estate sat on an open stretch of coastline directly beneath the flight path of the Palm Beach airport, with aircraft passing overhead constantly. One president after another looked at the offer and quietly chose to vacation somewhere far simpler instead. The building that was supposed to become a winter White House ended up hosting no one at all. It sat there magnificent and completely empty, slowly draining money for a purpose it never once fulfilled. A strikingly similar thing happened almost immediately with her other great gift. Marjorie had also left Hillwood, her Washington estate filled with French and Russian treasures, to the Smithsonian Institution, along with an endowment intended to help cover its operating costs. The Smithsonian initially accepted the gift. Then the math caught up with them too. The endowment simply did not cover what it actually cost to run the estate. And in 1976, the Smithsonian's governing board voted to hand Hillwood back to Marjorie's own charitable foundation. One of the most respected museum institutions in the entire country looked at this gift and decided it could not afford to keep it either. Camp Toppridge faced its own version of the same fate. Marjorie had left the Adirondack retreat to the state of New York, which kept the surrounding wilderness land as part of its forest preserve system, but found the actual built structures, the lodges, the Russian-style buildings among the pines, to be pure ongoing cost with no offsetting benefit. The state ultimately sold off the developed heart of the property to a private buyer for a fraction of what it had originally cost to construct, and simply walked away from the burden of maintaining it. Even the yacht had its own strange ending, though it happened earlier, separate from the rest of the estate. The massive sailing ship had already left the family years before Marjorie's death, sold in the 1950s to Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic. What had once been the largest private sailing yacht in the world eventually found new life decades later as a paying passenger cruise ship, its original owner's legacy reduced to a footnote in its long, strange history. And Mar-a-Lago, the crown jewel of the entire collection, suffered the hardest fall of all. After the federal government formally returned the estate to Marjorie's foundation around 1980, it went up for sale, listed at roughly $20 million, and it simply sat there. Buyer after buyer walked away, because purchasing the estate meant inheriting the exact same unsolvable financial burden that had already scared off the United States government itself. Multiple potential deals reportedly fell apart entirely. At one point, the situation grew serious enough that the town of Palm Beach actually approved a plan allowing the property to be demolished and subdivided into ordinary residential building lots. The single most expensive private home ever constructed in America came remarkably close to being torn down entirely, before finally selling in the mid-1980s for a fraction of what it had originally cost to build half a century earlier. Now here's the question this story's really asking underneath all of it. If Marjorie Post did not die broke, and she genuinely did not, how did her greatest creation end up here? When Marjorie passed away in 1973, her total wealth was still estimated at somewhere around $200 million, which translates to well over $1 billion in today's money. She stayed rich until the very end of her life. The financial collapse we're describing was never really about the overall size of her fortune. It was about the shape that fortune took and what happened to it structurally after she was gone. At her death, her estate split in 3 directions, divided among her 3 daughters along with various charitable foundations. Watch what happens just 1 generation further down that chain. One of her daughters later died, leaving an estate of roughly $74 million in her own right, still an enormous sum of money by any normal measure. But rather than passing along cleanly, that estate became tangled in a web of competing legal claims that stretched across multiple countries, with lawyers and tax authorities carving away a portion from every direction. Instead of compounding and growing the way concentrated wealth often does when it's actively managed as a single unit, the money scattered, and a meaningful share of it simply evaporated into legal fees, taxes, and the friction created by prolonged disputes. This is the pattern that plays out again and again across history whenever a large fortune gets divided repeatedly without any structure holding it together. Split it once, split it again, apply taxes and fees at every stage, and eventually sell off whatever costs too much to maintain. There's an old saying that captures this pattern almost perfectly, describing how the first generation builds a fortune, the second generation enjoys it, and by the third generation, the family is often back close to where it started. The one thing that could have genuinely broken that cycle for Marjorie's fortune, she simply never built. Look at what she actually owned by the time she died. Palaces, fine art, a yacht, an extraordinary jewelry collection. Beautiful, completely static possessions that require constant spending just to maintain their existence. What she did not hold on to, by the end, was direct control over the actual company generating all of that wealth in the first place. Her ownership stake in General Foods had gradually thinned and spread across the decades as the company grew, changed hands, and issued more shares, and she had stepped down from its board entirely back in the late 1950s. By the time General Foods was eventually sold to Philip Morris in 1985 for roughly $5.5 billion, more than a decade after Marjorie's death, that enormous sum went to public shareholders scattered across the market, not to her family. The Post family and the company that still carried traces of its origins had long since become entirely separate things. That's really the whole story compressed into a single sentence. She built some of the most valuable physical objects in the entire country and ended up holding onto the least durable form of wealth in the process, letting go of the actual income-producing engine while keeping only the monuments it had paid for. Now, if the story simply ended there, it would just be a sad footnote about one wealthy family and some very expensive real estate. But it becomes far more useful once you realize that other families, facing this exact same trap during the exact same era, found a completely different way through it. Head up into the mountains of western North Carolina, to an estate that makes even Mar-a-Lago look modest by comparison. Biltmore, the 250-room chateau that the Vanderbilt family built in the 1890s, remains the largest privately owned home in the entire United States to this day. By the middle of the 20th century, Biltmore had fallen into the exact same trap as Mar-a-Lago, bleeding money as an unsustainable monument with no source of income. By 1960, the estate was losing roughly $250,000 a year, and the family holding it could easily have made the same choice Marjorie's heirs eventually did: sell it off, hand it over to some outside institution, or simply let it fall into disrepair. Instead, a Vanderbilt descendant named William Cecil made a very different decision. Rather than treating Biltmore as a monument to be admired and passively maintained, he treated it as a business that needed to justify its own existence. The transformation was slow and genuinely humbling. After years of careful, grinding work, opening the house to paying visitors and reinvesting every dollar back into the property, Biltmore finally posted its first annual profit in 1968. The number was almost comically small, $16.24, not $16,000, not $16 million, just $16 for an estate of that scale. But that tiny number proved something enormously important. The place could, in principle, learn to support itself. From that point forward, growth followed. In 1985, the very same year Mar-a-Lago was finally being sold off at a steep discount, William Cecil opened a winery on the Biltmore property, completing a long-held vision of turning the estate into something genuinely self-sustaining. Today, Biltmore generates well over $100 million in annual revenue, every dollar of it earned directly through tourism, hospitality, and its winery operations, with no outside rescue funding required to keep it standing. The estate remains in the same family today, run across multiple generations, precisely because someone decided to build an actual engine underneath the monument instead of simply admiring the monument itself. Biltmore was far from the only family to figure this out. The DuPont family, whose fortune in gunpowder and chemicals predates the Post fortune by roughly a century, took a completely different but equally effective approach. Back in 1915, the family created a private holding company specifically designed to hold their controlling ownership stake in the family business as one unified block, preventing that ownership from gradually splitting apart and thinning out across generations of individual heirs the way stock ownership so often does. It was a plain, unglamorous legal structure. It was also remarkably effective, keeping a substantial ownership stake concentrated in family hands for more than 60 years. The Rockefeller family pursued a similar strategy, using a different tool entirely, establishing family trusts and a dedicated family office during the 1930s, specifically to manage their wealth collectively across generations, rather than allowing it to be divided and managed separately by dozens of individual heirs making independent decisions. The fortune built on Standard Oil has now passed successfully through multiple generations and remains substantially intact today, spread across a large number of descendants, precisely because it was structured from the start to be managed as one coordinated body, rather than being allowed to fracture into countless separate, uncoordinated inheritances. It's worth comparing that outcome to what happened on the opposite end of the very same family that built Biltmore in the first place. The broader Vanderbilt family, once considered among the wealthiest in the entire world, spread their original railroad fortune across so many heirs, so many competing mansions, and so many generations without any unifying structure holding it together, that by the time later generations gathered for family reunions, some accounts describe rooms full of Vanderbilt descendants without a single millionaire among them. The starting fortune was staggering. The ending point, for most branches of that same family, was strikingly ordinary. The difference was never really about how much money the family started with. It was entirely about whether anyone along the way built something durable enough to hold it together. The underlying idea connecting all of these successful examples is genuinely simple, even if executing it well takes real discipline. Keep the wealth functioning as one coordinated working unit, instead of slicing it into disconnected pieces the moment it changes hands. A holding company keeps ownership shares concentrated, so no single heir can unilaterally sell off a piece of the whole. A trust structure holds the core assets intact, while distributing only the income generated from them. A family office manages the entire fortune, with the discipline and accountability of an actual business, rather than leaving major decisions to whichever individual happens to be spending in any given generation. None of this is glamorous. Nobody builds a museum wing dedicated to a well-drafted trust document. But that unglamorous paperwork consistently outlasts even the most beautiful marble palace. Marjorie Merriweather Post built some of the most extraordinary physical monuments this country has ever seen, and she never built the quiet financial machine that could have carried them forward after she was gone. That, in the end, is the real difference between a family fortune that survives across generations and one that slowly dissolves into fees, taxes, and eventually, in Mar-a-Lago's case, a demolition permit that was only narrowly avoided at the last possible moment. There's one small, genuinely encouraging postscript worth mentioning before we close this out. Hillwood, the estate the Smithsonian eventually handed back, did not simply disappear or crumble into neglect. Marjorie's own foundation reopened it as a public museum, charging admission and running paid tours, essentially forcing the property to finally earn its own keep the way an ongoing institution eventually has to. It stands today as the one piece of her legacy that ultimately survived fully intact. And fittingly, it's the one piece that was eventually required to support itself, rather than simply being admired from a distance. So here's the real takeaway sitting underneath this entire story. Money alone was never actually the problem for Marjorie Post. She had more of it than almost anyone in the country, right up until the day she died. The problem was that beauty, no matter how extraordinary, has never once been the thing capable of carrying a fortune forward on its own. Only structure does that. And that lesson honestly doesn't just apply to families building $100 million palaces. It applies just as much to any family business, any inheritance, any savings plan meant to outlast the person who originally built it. The monument might be what people remember, but it's always the boring, unglamorous machine underneath it that decides whether anything actually survives. If this story taught you something new today, let me know in the comments which part surprised you most, whether it was the government turning down a free palace, or the $16 profit that eventually saved an even bigger one. Share this with someone who genuinely find this as fascinating as you clearly do. And make sure you're following this channel because we've got plenty more stories like this one lined up. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.